This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We are in the throes of Christmas activities and festivities here at the school and probably in our lives.
Yes.
Today was Ugly Sweater Day.
Was it Ugly Sweater today?
Yep.
Today?
Yep.
I guess I didn't realize we were officially doing that. I mean, I wore a Christmas T-shirt, but I don't have an ugly sweater Christmas one. I guess I have other ones that are ugly. But
I wore my not ugly but amazing Hanukkah shirt today with a gigantic menorah on the front.
I mean, it's the right time of year. I mean, we are getting close.
Thursday, technically, but that's fine.
Is that the beginning
Yeah.
of Hanukkah? So
I forgot it was Ugly Sweater Day, so I just wore a normal ugly sweater
Ugly
day.
sweater. Non-Christmas ugly sweater.
it's ugly nonetheless, just not Christmas ugly. No, that's not an ugly sweater. It looks fine.
The Kringle Jingle party is tonight for all staff and students at the college, so I'll break out my Grinch sweatshirt.
Oh,
It's kind of like a Grinch sweatshirt, not really a sweater.
Yeah.
But it's a Whoville-themed Christmas party, so it'll be party appropriate.
I think next year he should change it. This is put on by our president, Dr. Frank Weller. He should put on a Pringle jingle and have all sorts of Pringles. I love Pringles
you
so
go.
much. Lots of
least
different
have
flavors of Pringles.
At least have a Pringle bar.
Right,
Yep.
exactly.
Build your own Pringle, huh?
I mean, or, you can make a sandwich of different flavors if you like, but I really like Pringles. They've gone, this is getting so far, they got so high up in price.
Oh,
It used to be
really?
$1 a can. Now it's $2 for the same can, but probably a smaller can because everything's smaller. I sound like an old boomer, but that's fine. Apologies
do
to
you-
boomer
And less
listeners.
chips in the can.
Yes.
Do you take different flavors and put the chips together to get kind of unique
So actually,
flavors?
we were talking about this at lunch. And someone asked me that. And I said, no, I just eat the whole can.
Okay.
Like I just eat a can at a time.
Yeah.
They're so good.
I believe I'm not a big flavored Pringles guy, so I'm not into it as into it as you are, but I applaud your love of Pringles.
Thanks, man. I need the affirmation today.
Yeah. Yeah, your voice is a little froggy.
Yeah,
So you're
we've
battling?
We've been battling. Whatever. Just a throat thing. That's about all I got.
If next week Ron and I sound like that, you'll know where we got it.
That's fine.
We could have had you wearing a mask today, but that would undermine the sound quality of your vocals over there. So
That's not all it would undermine.
Yeah. Faith over fear, bro.
all right.
Yeah, but it's the last week of school,
Mhm.
last week of classes. Next week is finals, and then we all begin celebrating Christmas with whoever
Yeah.
we celebrate with.
Well, I mean, I'm celebrating already. I wanted my Christmas decorations up. I came in the day after Thanksgiving and got all the lights and the garland around my office door and around my windows.
That's last week's news.
I know, but I'm celebrating.
He's very excited.
I
about
am
his daughter.
I am excited
We should
about
post
it.
a picture of it on the Facebooks.
Yeah, there you go. That way people can just see how much I love
Yeah.
Christmas.
Well, it looks like we're gonna have episodes drop on Christmas Day. So that'll
Yeah,
be
Christmas
interesting.
Day and New Year's
We'll
Day.
see if we do something special.
Yeah, if you got any recommendations, let us know between now and then.
But don't ask us to sing a song.
No.
Our only other bit of news to share is, last week we took back from SBL a Shamgar paper that we're going to return to in a little bit.
Right.
But also, we took home the new SBL study Bible.
Yeah.
Now, in the past, you guys have asked us for recommendations. What's a good study Bible? What's a good Bible? And we often say the NRSV, the NIV are pretty good translations, and they have pretty good study Bibles. A lot of us use the HarperCollins Study Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the HarperCollins Study Bible is being replaced by the SBL Study Bible.
Yeah.
So if you were a fan of the HarperCollins Study Bible tradition, and it's time to get a new Bible, which it was for me. Like, my cover was barely attached
Yeah.
to the pages on the inside. Then what you want to get is the SBL Study Bible, and it has the same high quality study notes as the HarperCollins. It's the same publisher. It has the Deuterocanonical or Apocrypha books in the middle, as well as introductions and commentary on those, which is one of the main selling points for me. Like,
Yeah,
I want study notes on those books because I just don't know those books as well
Right.
as I know the biblical books.
Right.
It's like having a commentary on all of those books. And they've updated, the list of people who contributed introductions. I think one of the things that stand out, if you notice this kind of thing, is like almost half the introductions are written by women.
Yeah.
Representing the presence of women in the Society of Biblical Literature and among scholarship in general. And I've noticed, I don't know, Ron, if you notice the same thing, that the tone of the introductions is even a little bit different.
Yeah, I think that they're in the HarperCollins. If your interpretation or whatever leaned a little bit more towards what we call the conservative side, you felt like they were talking down to you, like they had a little bit of contempt. And I don't think you see that as much in this one. I think that they're more generous towards, either pole of interpretation, and that's welcome. I mean, I like the HarperCollins. It's my go-to English Bible, but sometimes I don't like it if they're criticizing a position that I hold to. And it's nice to have a Bible that presents all the points of view and doesn't necessarily try to stake out a claim on one of those.
And I do think they land in similar places as the HarperCollins notes.
Mm-hmm.
They just are a little more gracious in how they present it all. And that's one of the things I just didn't like about the HarperCollins. I'm like, these study notes underneath the passages are just amazing.
Yeah,
they're perfect.
I agree.
They always are answering the questions that I have. The introductions, if you are sensitive about your theory or your approach of who wrote it or when it was written or what the genre is, or if you're sensitive about those things, the HarperCollins would just trigger you. And I think this one doesn't. And so I think it makes it so it's better for a wider audience.
Yep,
So.
I agree. Well, and I like it too because there's they have little boxes in the text where they're giving additional information, and now they're even directing you to websites and online sources with useful information. And I think that just shows their willingness to stay up. We're in the 21st century. Let's give them 21st century resources to use, and they're thinking about where biblical scholarship is. I can criticize SBL at times, but I also want to praise them when they do things well. And I think that they've done a good job with this study Bible.
Yeah. And along the lines of updates, the NRSV version has been updated. There's now an NRSV UE.
The UE.
And the UE is for updated edition. So there are significant changes to the translation. Not like significantly going to change doctrine.
Right, yeah.
Although passages that, we walk people through and said, no, that's not what the Hebrew really says, or that's not what the Greek really says. The translation is a little outdated here. This volume catches several of those. And you talked about before the episode, the 1 Corinthians 11, where it says that women ought to have a sign of authority, over on her head, right? And then there's a little note in the NRSV that said, the Greek omits sign of.
Exactly.
And this one goes ahead and fixes that.
Yeah, there are a lot of passages in the New Testament that stand out to me as examples of theological translation rather than just trying to get sort of the basic sense of the Greek. And that passage in 1 Corinthians is one of them. Women should have a symbol of authority on their head. And that's not what it says at all. And the translators went, you know what, you're right. That's not what it says. We should translate it in such a way that allows people to make their own decisions. And so it just says a woman should have authority over her own head, which is pretty much what it says in Greek. And that's a good translation. And then people can debate what that means.
Yeah, right.
But at least you're getting the sense of what Paul, was originally saying. They haven't done that in every sense. There was another passage I looked at. I'm like, nope, I still think you get that one wrong. But I think they've done a good job of at least thinking through some of those debatable passages and making, coming up with a better translation.
Yeah. So anyway, it's not really a commercial. It's just we're updating you because you've asked for recommendations before, and we've said, hey, NRSV HarperCollins is the one we use. Well, not anymore.
Yep.
Things move on, and we have to move on too. And so all my pages are stuck together now. I got to break in a new Bible.
Well, a lot of them are actually literally stuck together at the top where they didn't do a good job. So as I'm reading through it, I have to be careful I don't accidentally rip a page because I'm flipping it open. I got to get those little pages separated out there the way they should be.
Yeah.
So we'll get there. It's a good book, good Bible.
Well, that's enough news.
Yeah.
Sure, why not?
So now to answer the question everyone's been asking.
All two of them.
Both those listeners. All of our moms have written into us. Were you serious that day?
You may have listened to last week's episode and said, what in the world is going on? And if you did not go all the way to the end, I mean, we had little clues in here to say something is up here.
Yep.
Right? And last week's episode on Shamgar, we exposed in our outro as being how do we put it?
A satire.
A satirical interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
The
A
best
satire.
satires happen.
We are not satirizing the Bible. No. We are satirizing people who use terrible techniques to interpret the Bible to make it say what they want it to say.
Right.
And we thought it would be fun to do an episode where we gave our own overblown interpretation of Shamgar.
Yeah.
And tried to take all the techniques that we teach students not to do and like do them yet on steroids.
Yep.
Big time. Well, and that's just it. I mean, the kinds of arguments that we made last week are arguments that you will find in books published by pastors or other people trying to pass themselves off as Bible experts. And so we're just like, all right, we've seen it. And if I'm being honest, I've probably been guilty of a little bit of that when I was younger. If I go back in time
Sure.
and I think to the early days of me being a Bible teacher and just being so excited about it, like, oh, this is really cool. I think this is really great. And then over time you go, oh, that's not as great as I thought it was. And so if I'm going to criticize other people, I have to be honest enough to say there was a time when I probably made one or two of those mistakes myself.
Just not with Shamgar.
Not with Shamgar, but in
No
some
one's put
other
this much
places.
work
in
into
life.
Shamgar.
We tried to pick a character who is as obscure as you can get,
Yes.
right? So that we're not walking into too many theological
Sure.
minefields of offending people theologically. Although we kind of offended ourselves theologically.
A little bit.
What messianic status we were given to Shamgar.
Yeah. I did feel like I had to bathe in holy water when we were done.
Yeah. So, and we gave some clues along the way, like Drew, our audio editor, kind of in the intro, kind of did a little twang in the middle of the sound to say, wait, whoa, what happened there?
Something doesn't sound quite right here.
In our outro, we outed it as a satirical interpretation, and then Drew did that trippy wind down. Those are all clues. If you were halfway through the episode and you didn't think we were joking, certainly by the end you would catch it. And our fear is that some people just turned it off in the middle and never got to the end and find out what it really was.
Yeah.
That was the risk, and
Yeah.
we were willing to take it.
We took the risk.
But today, what we want to do is actually deconstruct that episode.
Yeah.
Like just kind of point out the fallacies we were overtly using and satirizing while using them, and just to kind of highlight how these techniques are currently used and maybe how to spot them. And I think some of you were disturbed at how convincing we were.
But I had people actually say that to me.
Yeah.
You know, Greg Stauffer, a friend of the podcast, you've heard him on the podcast, he came in and said, you know, if somebody doesn't know you're joking, they're going to take you seriously. It wasn't totally obvious that you guys are joking around. I said, Greg, I think you're right. You know, let's make sure people understand what was going on.
Yeah. But that's the point, though. There are some smart people who sound smart and use smart words and can maybe even flout some educational credentials out there who give fantastical interpretations with all passion and conviction and detail, and it sounds just as intense, just as believable, just as credible as we sounded last week.
Yeah.
And so, so it's kind of catch-22. If you sound too convincing, then people might be convinced. If you don't sound convincing enough, then it's not very good satire.
Right.
You have to enter into the world to expose just how potent the world is and potentially dangerous the world is.
But I mean, that's where I would encourage people, even with us. You know, we're educated people whose entire lives are spent being Bible teachers, language experts, historical, all that kind of stuff. We're bringing the best that we have to their study of the Bible. And so I think that gives us a high degree of credibility. But that doesn't mean that we're absolutely right. People should still feel free to say, hey, guys, listen to you. You made a good argument. What about this? And we get that. People will sometimes write us notes and say, hey, heard what you said. Have you taken this into consideration? There's nothing wrong with pushing back and asking good follow-up questions.
So we'll go through the same order as last week,
Yeah,
right?
we'll go through the same arguments and debunk them this time.
We'll talk about
You want to start us out, Sam?
Are we starting with the facts?
Maybe
Nothing but the
we'll
facts,
talk
man?
about Rachel W.
Right. Yeah,
We
should
did start
with
with, because that's where we launched with this right
So it was okay. I don't know how much background I want to give, but we talked about, as we said, doing an episode on Shamgar, and we talked about would there be an actual paper at SBL, and there was.
Yep,
that's true.
true.
We had intentions of going to the paper, but there were other more compelling papers at the same time that were actually important to our fields, so that we went to those instead. So we didn't actually go to her paper. We did read her abstract that sort of summarizes, that did give her conclusion, and so So all apologies to her if
It's why we didn't give her full name.
yes, because we weren't trying to. We're using her as a foil, right?
Yeah.
It's a technique. I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to her argument.
Yes.
Because the reality is, the things we sort of acted like didn't matter, they matter. And like he's not said as the judge. He's got one verse. I mean, really, what are we talking about here? And so I think there's perhaps some validity to what she could have argued had we gone to the paper and listened to it, which we did not.
Yeah.
When we read the abstract, and it's just like, oh, he's probably more of a minor judge than you thought. Or even not even classified as a judge, but just someone who did impressive things during the period that overlapped with JL.
Yeah.
And that followed the time of Ehud, probably contemporaneous with Deborah.
Right.
And so it's quite possible he wasn't a judge, but he is an honorable mention because he did what judges often do, which is deliver Israel from a particular political enemy.
Yeah, engage in some warfare of some sort, and
Yeah, and so like whether he's a judge or not, or a major or minor, who cares? I mean, these are secondary categories, right?
Yeah.
The Bible doesn't say Ehud, the judge, Deborah, the judge. It just says so and so, delivered Israel from their opponent, and sometimes they served as judge for a number of years.
They judged for X amount of years, right?
Yeah, and Deborah really stands out for one who actually had judicial functions, listed as a part of what she did during her time. Not all the other ones actually speak like that.
Judge it's just not a great term for what they were.
Yeah,
like they were saviors, to be honest.
Yeah, they were deliverers.
Yeah, deliverers.
Yeah.
More, but anyway,
and they kept the peace in not fully king, but not unking-like altogether manner. And so it's quite possible her thesis was spot on.
Yeah.
And we just didn't go to the. Now, to be clear, we didn't say we went to her paper last week. Ron said he didn't go to the paper, but we didn't say, but we did. Right? We just based it on her abstract. So Rachel W., hopefully you feel vindicated that this was not.
I doubt she's familiar with our podcast, but if she is, I'm sure we'll hear.
Did you hear these three guys, Rachel, that made a podcast about you? I don't think she heard that.
She probably did what is real scholarship on Shamgar, which is the opposite of what we did. And that's why she was our foil, because our foil was true scholarship. Well, in taking on the persona of these crazy scholars, we were trying to do the opposite of true scholarship. So, of course, we had to put down the true scholars that are doing the nitty-gritty detail work and make them look like nerds who don't respect the Bible the way we do. That's exactly a technique of people towards scholarship who don't understand scholarship.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we were entering the role fully and
doing our best.
So that's why we left the last name out.
The scary thing is how easy that is too. Well, I don't want to say it was too easy because you actually worked pretty hard, John. You put a lot of time into coming up with the stuff that we're going to address today.
I mean, it was a plane ride.
Basically.
You had to do something on the way to San Antonio. Oh.
All right, so want to go deeper into the
let's do it.
The arguments?
Yeah, the first one was with the name, the actual name Shamgar.
Oh my gosh.
And
it was fun.
It was fun. What we're going to find, and you need to understand this, listener. A lot of times when people go to original languages and roots, they're committing what we call the root fallacy.
Yeah.
They'll say a word means something, but it doesn't always mean that, number one. And when it's in a compound, it doesn't always, you don't just put those two things together. That's not always how it works. And so we did that very thing. We had sham, which can mean a couple things, and we kind of played off all of them. And then we had gar, and we committed the ultimate of making one Hebrew and one Greek. That's not a thing, right?
That's just not how language works at all.
Yeah, so gar, which, I mean, you started out by saying, ger.
Yes.
It's kind of like ger in Hebrew, but we point out, but in Greek, gar
right.
is for.
Yeah.
And then you got the sham, which is there, and the gar, which is gar in Greek, which is for, and we got the word therefore, so that we could have the whole therefore speech.
Yes.
Yeah. It was so bad. And, when I'm teaching Greek to my students, and we actually use a book called Exegetical Fallacies, and we go through.
Carson?
Yeah, D.A. Carson's. And we go through a lot of these word fallacies, and we talk about the root fallacies. And it's like, we have words nowadays, like pineapple. It's like nobody thinks a pineapple comes from a pine tree or tastes like an apple. Like you can break it down into its constituent parts and think you're coming up with a definition. How much worse is it if you think that a word is made of two different languages that one of which really didn't exist in its biblical form when this was happening, hundreds of years beforehand. The whole thing just breaks down so quickly, but it sounds so good. See, that's the scary part. Is it just like, oh man, yeah, I can see it. It really seems to work. Until you dig into the history and you go, no, there's no possible way that could work.
And here's why we get drawn to that. It's because sometimes people are given names in the Bible and they mean things.
For sure.
Yeah.
Peter's name, Jesus is called Jesus because he will save Israel from their sins, right?
Yeah.
And it's the word for save. And so because some people are named symbolically and their name does have meaning that's even relevant to the story. I mean, even Shem, who's called Shem, whose name means name, in that section of Genesis, we have that theme of the city of Babylon to make a name for themselves. And then God tells Abraham, but I will make a name for you. And he's a descendant of Shem. And so the theme of name is actually intrinsic to the story.
Yeah.
Right. And it means something and it's used. Like Isaac's name means laughter. And you're like, in the story, Sarah laughs when she hears she's going to have a baby. And so to ask, does Shamgar's name mean anything? That's not the worst thing in the world to do.
Correct.
Right.
But if we were to, I don't know, Sam, in Hebrew, if you were to kind of break that into what it would mean, Shamgar, where would you go with that?
I looked up before in the lexicon, like, yeah, we don't know. Like it means nothing. It's probably a loan name or word from perhaps Hittite or somewhere else. And so it doesn't necessarily have a Hebrew equivalent.
Right.
And so to make it that is to make it do something that it probably didn't do in the first place.
So if it's a loan word from a different language, then again, applying Hebrew and even worse, Greek to it is to violate the very name itself.
Right.
And so if it's, you said so, it's probably, or it could be like a Hittite name.
If I recall, it's something like, that would be an example of like another Semitic language in the area that they just, It'd be like if, I don't know, like you name your kid a French name, like Jean-Pierre or something, right? Like, well, technically in English it means something, but it doesn't mean exactly what it means in the French, and then you like go crazy with it. That's just not how how language works.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So probably no significance behind the name Shamgar.
No. Sorry.
At least none that we can discern this far in the future.
Yeah. So our error was dividing the word in half and making each half symbolic in two different languages and putting them together.
Yeah.
Now, what about, because I heard this recently at a youth conference, like when you see the word therefore, you should ask what's there for.
Yes.
Is that a valid principle?
Yes. Don't shake your head. Yes, it's a valid principle.
I just want to make sure what I'm saying is correct. Because now I feel like I'm so like on my like caught up in this stuff. I don't want to say the wrong thing. Well, the thing of it is, there's no therefore in Greek. That's my point.
Right.
There is no therefore in Greek, and so it's a word play. That's a wonderful word play, but it only works in English.
Yes.
Like it doesn't work in Greek.
But there is a Greek word that means what our English word.
Yeah, like in Greek you have un.
So when you see un, you should ask what it's there for.
Sure.
Even if un doesn't sound like
therefore.
It doesn't sound like it. So when you see un, you should ask what un is doing.
It's a logical progression word in Greek, and in the same way that therefore is in English.
Yeah. Un says, I just said something, now I'm about to say something else that builds on what I just said. I'm kind of tying these two things together in a logical progression. Yeah.
So when you see the word therefore in English, it does mean...
It does the same thing.
It does signal that this is there for a reason.
Right.
And it kind of tells, read what I'm going to say now in light of what I just finished saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
It does mean that.
Absolutely.
Just, that's not what Shamgar's name's about.
Clearly.
It's definitely not what it's about.
All right. You want to introduce the next crazy move we did, Ron?
Yeah.
After he finds his glasses.
Yeah, my glasses were over behind me. I had to put my glasses on. So the next thing we did is we got into a little bit of numerology.
So good.
And numerology is fun because it does, it shows up in the Bible, the book of Revelation, the beast being, the number 666 or 616, depending on which textual variant you're talking about. So it's a biblical thing, though. That's just it. Numerology shows up in the Bible, so it's not wrong to do numerology. But the way we kind of went about the numerology went well beyond what we actually see in the Bible. We were just looking for any possible connection we could with certain numbers. or even like taking the numbers associated with certain letters and trying to build them up. It's a kind of what we might call parallelomania, where you're just looking as far as you can. It's like, oh, we finally found a parallel between this number and this thing, and really kind of shoving it together and making it work.
So what we observed is that Shamgar was the third judge, and we looked for other thirds, right? Especially since he was the third of 12 judges, to make it more credible.
Right.
Let's look at other. Now we could have just looked for thirds in the Bible,
right?
But this is next level insanity, right? And so we wanted to find third in a series of 12,
right?
And so are there other parallels like that? Well, it just so happens 12 is a significant number in the Bible. So yeah, there are multiple series of 12 disciples, of course, 12 tribes of Israel. So we could go to those tribes and look for characteristics of the third in that list that we could embellish and ultimately find a way to connect the dot between the third person in that list and Jesus.
Right.
Yeah. It came too well.
It worked out
like really,
well.
like Levi being the third, right?
Right, yeah.
And him being a priest. Of course, when the New Testament talks about the priesthood of Jesus, it does not base it on Levi.
Right.
Matter of fact, Hebrews goes the opposite direction.
Yeah.
You cannot trace Jesus' lineage to Levi. You have to reestablish Jesus' lineage on the basis of Melchizedek.
Right, yeah. Because that's like one of the arguments as Christians are trying to argue for the priesthood of Jesus. All the opponents are going, oh, you can't do that. He's not from the tribe of Levi. It doesn't count. They're calling foul and throwing the red flag and all that. And that's why the author of Hebrews says, well, let's go back to our scriptures and look for a king priest. And Melchizedek, wow, look at that. That actually works quite well. But yeah, the Levi thing clearly doesn't work for Jesus.
Yeah, but the reality is I think we could have done it with any of the sons. Like if you were Judah, that would have been even better, right?
Right.
But like, just because if you are coming at it with a particular perspective, you can make it fit. You can make it work.
Yeah. That's a really good point. If it was Judah, we could have just easily pointed to Jesus.
Right.
And I'm sure just about any of the sons.
We could have figured
three of us are clever enough that we could just count the letters of their name. That's the same number of letters the name of Jesus.
Right.
When translated into Polish.
Or even or even a story from that character's history.
Exactly.
That has and that's why it's called parallelomania. If you've never heard this word before, it's seeing connections everywhere that aren't actually there. And you make it fit because it makes sense to you.
Yeah, like if it was Simeon, and he's the one with Levi who avenged his sister Dinah.
Right.
Like he was the big brother who stuck up for his violated sister.
Right.
Just like Jesus, our big brother, stuck up for us and defeated our enemies. Right. Like there's no son that we could not have worked with.
Yeah, Jesus was
honestly,
given enough time.
I mean, Reuben was the firstborn, and Jesus is the first and only begotten of the Father. Right. And therefore, Reuben is a type of Christ.
Yeah, Jesus was being Simeon to the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. It's like all of a sudden now you got
there you go.
Come on,
great parallel.
Let's go, Ron.
See?
Yeah. It's that easy.
I know. That's the thing. It is so easy.
But I will say this. And the reason why this has an air of validity is because the Bible does do it. So, for example, the second born.
Yes.
That is an actual theme in Genesis. It's a pretty important theme. And so, yet you're supposed to trace that through. This, you're not supposed to. And I guess...
Explain the second-born theme, like why that's a thing.
That the firstborn son was supposed to receive a double portion of the inheritance, the lines past that, that it's an important thing to be the firstborn son. But multiple times in Genesis, it's not the firstborn, it's the secondborn. So Isaac is technically not the firstborn. Mm-hmm. Ishmael is. Jacob. Sorry, I couldn't get the name. Jacob's not the firstborn; he's the secondborn. So this idea, and then Joseph, kind of moving down, and then all the way through, these sons are not what you would expect for the line to work, and yet God is working through these secondborns or not firstborn sons throughout the texts.
Am I remembering right that Jacob crosses his hands when he blesses Joseph's sons, like he has his right hand?
Isaac?
No, Joseph's sons. When he's at the end of Genesis, Jacob's blessing Joseph's sons, and he crosses his hands.
That's
so he's like, "Oh, your right hand's supposed to be on the firstborn, not the secondborn."
Yeah, and so that is a theme that is intentional that you're supposed to bring out of the text, not force something in retroactively. It's almost like reading forward versus reading backward. And as long as you're reading forward and seeing how it works out, of course, as opposed to, this other thing happened, or keep going back and back to find validity for our theory, that's when it's not okay.
Yeah, the firstborn theme works in Genesis because it appears to be a deliberate pattern that we see throughout the patriarchal lineage.
Right.
Like it's there in multiple passages, and attention is drawn to it. Like you said, intentionally crosses his hands to bless the one you wouldn't normally bless, and to bless the other one that you chose to bless, for a reason that violates ancient Near Eastern code and practice. Like that is a theme. It's traced across multiple passages. Shamgar being the third, like that theme's not really going on in Judges, right? If there was like the theme of thirds and parallels, and there are different judges who parallel different kings, like if there's anything to lend credence to Shamgar's, what we were doing with Shamgar should be done within the context of that book, because there are other literary clues in the book that beg us to do that. And I think another valid thing that we're sort of imitating, which makes it seem to be a stronger argument than it is the fact of Hebrew parallelism. They do delight sometimes in pointing out how this parallels that, parallels this, parallels that. And so that's what makes it a little bit more credible to anyone who's kind of used to the sophistication of Hebrew narrative. They like doing that kind of thing. But our parallels are hopping all over the Bible. And like, the third disciple in the order of which they appear, and like, come on.
I know, right?
What are we doing out here?
And I think that's what it is. It feels so contrived. Instead of looking at going, that really plays out. I can see that. It doesn't feel like you're forcing it. A person thinking through what we're saying there is going to go, okay, guys, this seems like you're really reaching here. And our response is, you're right. We really did reach on that.
Yeah, and Abel being the third, I caught myself. Both me and you, Sam, along the way made certain errors and then recovered. But like Abel being the third human. Well, actually, he wasn't, because he was the fourth, but he was a third male. And so, so we wanted to get the number 3 out of Abel. If it wasn't going to work by making him the third human, then we were all right, what is he the third of? And we were able to go with third male.
He's a third dude.
But is the number of who was first, second, or third, fourth humans mean anything anywhere in the Bible?
No.
At most, there's a typology of the first human, Adam, and Christ. Right. But that's outside of that. The number of the original people in the garden account is insignificant throughout the scriptures. And so us making it disproportionately significant to establish Shamgar as a martyr, despite the fact that, and James, third disciple, as a martyr, and despite the fact that nowhere in the Shamgar account is his death even talked about. Let alone like his death being a martyr's death. He was doing all the killing in the account. And we made him out to be a martyr by counting which judge he was. That should be a clue. Like, there's nothing in the immediate context that points to this. We're getting meaning from somewhere else because we're creative. That's the end of it.
Really good imaginations, though.
All right. Sam, you want to do another one?
Sure. Which, well, I can jump ahead. I don't know how much time we have.
We got about 10 minutes. 12 minutes.
So the idea of Shamgar being egalitarian. So this is the fallacy of anachronism, meaning we're taking modern ideas and concepts and foisting them back on ancient texts and cultures and practices. We do this all the time, by the way. Not we, but people do.
People do it on a regular basis.
Right. And while some of the human experience is the same, they're in different times and places, different contexts. And so you can't just do that. And so there was no understanding of egalitarianism in the ancient world. And surely that's not what he was doing. Right. The fact that just because he's overlapping, and like we put so much like extra stuff in there that, well, if he's at the same time as Deborah, the reason why he doesn't make a big deal of it is because he wants to elevate her, is a ludicrous statement. And yet it could be made and was made by us.
And Deborah's name isn't even mentioned in any of the verses.
Right.
Like he was mentioned in parallel with Jael. Not Deborah. So there's like one step removed, and we had to just remove Jael from it and put him right next to Deborah, when the two verses about him don't talk about him in the same sentence as Deborah.
It's literary proximity, and that's about it.
And so he's got to be careful not to, because you see someone acting a certain way or being portrayed a certain way, and then you extrapolate that even more. Well, it must have been because of this or because of that, which lines up with my other view that exists right now is just too much. That's too much putting things into the text that it doesn't say. So the fact that he existed probably at the same time as Deborah because he existed at the same time as Jael, but was not made a big deal of. You can't justify that by saying he was egalitarian, didn't want the limelight. Like that. That's just a ludicrous thing to say. There are plenty of other reasons that could be postulated, like he may not have been an actual judge. Right? That would be a more scholarly approach to it.
She was the more prominent one. He was a military successful person, like a commander, and she was more like the leader.
Yeah, I mean, she was a judge and a prophet. She's got a lot of cred there. That, and again, I'm not trying to find fault with Shamgar, but he doesn't seem to have that same sort of, doesn't have the same credentials that really elevate you in like ancient Israelite society. Like she's a judge and a prophet. Wow, she's really impressive. Shamgar, he's impressive, but not just the same way. So
I mean, he's almost like Barak.
Yes.
I mean, it's almost like he's got two names. It's Shamgar / Barak, where like he's this dude and he has some victories, but Deborah's the main character.
Right.
Like that makes more sense than anything else.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think we can say that the Old Testament portrays women in a much more favorable light, right, than ancient cultures. Like their laws tend to be more elevating of women or protecting of women, where other laws didn't. And so you might say, wow, the author of Judges kind of stands out in like highlighting how big, prominent Deborah was at a time when men were usually the prominent ones. But that's different than saying egalitarian, right? And they're kind of foisting all that comes with today's egalitarian agenda back onto Shamgar, who says nothing about his view of women at all.
Exactly.
Oh, that was a fun one.
That was pretty fun.
That was a fun one to play
much.
with. Over the top.
And I will say, this is an aside, through most of these, I struggled. Because Rod's over here like, oh, yeah, for sure, John. Like, no.
We got to play the role.
Doing? I know, you did great.
Play the role.
It was hard for me to just go along.
You did pretty good, too. I was impressed.
I tried. It's like saying yes while shaking my head no. Yes.
That is remarkable. I can't believe that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So another fact we brought out last week is that Othniel defeated Aram, Ehud defeated Moab, Shamgar defeated the Philistines. And then we jump to, like David, who was the one who defeated the Philistines. Again, that's a thing in common, right? That him and David had in common. We wouldn't have pointed it out if David wasn't a link to Jesus. And Jesus being linked to David, we're able to use David to find something that Shamgar had in common with David, and to find as many of those things as possible. Like we did, we also, drew a line to David by pointing out that he was the third king, right? For which we have to go back to Judges to find the first king, Abimelech, who technically was the first person to crown himself as king. But when people are talking about the monarchy of Israel, they usually start with Saul.
Right.
And technically, one of Saul's sons was made king before David.
Right.
A certain contingency. So like he's probably the fourth or like third and a half anyway.
Yeah. So there's more wiggle room. Right.
Yeah.
To get, if the number we needed was 5, we could have gotten there.
Probably.
Yeah.
If
There's
it was
always
2,
a way to make
we
it
could have
work.
gotten there. Like, there's enough fluidity with enough data, you can make the Bible say just about anything you want it to.
Yeah. And that's how cult leaders rise to power, is because they understand that push things hard enough and wiggle them hard enough, you can make everything fit. It might not be a good argument, but you can somehow make it work.
All right. How about, let's go to his father, Anat.
It was bad.
Yeah, this is where we really, really went off the rails. Because go ahead.
Well, this was funny because this is, if you remember from Anat, we pointed out that the first letter of his name sounded like the ah sound, which is the beginning letter of most alphabets, and the last letter of his name made the ta sound, which is the last sound of the Hebrew alphabet.
Right.
And so when we have the beginning of the alphabet and the end of the alphabet, and then Nun is not the middle letter, and we wanted to say beginning, middle, and end, but Nun wasn't in the middle, so we had to, but we found, but it's the 14th letter, which is a multiple of 7s. So it's the perfect middle of a number list that's around 24. You have to somehow get a middle number that's near 7, and we rounded, again, special pleading to get things to line up.
Right.
What was most wrong with that, Sam?
Well, almost. It's a combo where the actual Hebrew letter for anath is an ayin, which is not the first letter. It's an aleph, and it doesn't make the a sound. It just doesn't. And so it's not the first letter. It's just not in any way can it possibly be the first letter.
Yeah.
Right. The ayin is like, I don't know, 17th or something.
Yeah.
It's
like
way down there.
2/3 of the way into the
Yeah.
alphabet.
And and it definitely doesn't make the a sound. If anything, it's a guttural sort of with a vowel sound to it. Like that's
yeah,
what
we
it-
don't have an English equivalent.
Yeah.
Which is why people say like ah.
Right.
Like it kind of can make the ah sound, which the aleph also kind of makes. But in Hebrew, no, it's a lot more guttural.
Yes.
It's coming from a deeper place.
Yes, and so and you attach lots of vowels to it, not just an A vowel. It could
Yep.
be an E vowel, O vowel. Anyway,
Exactly.
and so that's why that's why when I said, "Oh, it's an aleph," you go, "No, it's an ayin." Like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So but we didn't say that out loud. It was all going on like here around the table.
But in reality, it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you were listening along and it made sense
Hopefully.
to you,
Yeah,
I mean, at some level,
Yeah.
it just shows you when people are working outside of their natural language and they don't understand how the letters and the words and the sounds work, you can draw conclusions. And this, I don't know, we kind of in the pre-show we could talk about. This is the kind of the fallacy of the was it
The Bible
enough
code.
to be dangerous.
the enough to be
the
dangerous.
enough to be dangerous. Yeah, fallacy.
Yeah, and when it comes to language, if you just learn enough to be dangerous, you can get some weird things out of the Bible.
Yeah, and the Bible code, the whole concept of it has just exposed that where they
People
would do,
probably aren't familiar with the Bible code.
it's
That's back in the 90s.
yeah,
Early 2000s.
yeah,
Early 2000s.
And so like every letter has a numerical value, and every letter like you can count to certain ones, and so like they will count to a certain point in different books and see what's the word or what's the letter there, and like they're bringing together all these things to make it say something as though God, they would say, embedded in the text a code within the words.
Yeah.
A code that we couldn't discover until we had the computer technology that could analyze it in such a way
Right.
as to produce those kind of results.
And like that would be like a knot is a very simple like example of that, where you take the letters and they do more than just like convey a word, right? And I think it's based by people like come at it like isn't the Bible amazing and couldn't God do this? Yes, God could do that, but what's to think that God did do that? Like, why would God need to do that? The Bible is not functioning in that way. It's functioning to communicate how God has interacted with the world since the beginning of time and what God is trying to do in the world. Right? That's what the Bible is trying to do. Not have some secret code that we can pull out. Like, this isn't Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, what are we talking about?
Yeah.
Well, and the thing about the Bible code is I knew a lot of people who were so excited about it. Like the church where I was working at the time, there were a lot of people who were like, "This is amazing," and the book was just, it was flying off the shelves.
Right.
And then 10 years later, nobody's talking about it anymore.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it was a bestseller at the time.
Yeah, it
Among
was.
sensationalist-driven Christians, it
Yeah.
was flying off their ass.
Yeah.
Yep. And now nobody even thinks about it. Like it had no legs. Like it was just really sensational. It was exciting. And then people are like, this doesn't prove anything. Like it doesn't enhance our understanding of God, the Bible, what it means to be God's people. It doesn't do anything for us. And more people started coming out and saying, this is bunk. You shouldn't be listening to it. This is not a good way to handle the Bible. And I think that with good translation, it's going to, or not translation, but also interpretation, application, it's going to stand the test of time. And things like this don't stand the test of time.
Yep. So yeah, that as creative as and ludicrous as that was, like there was a popular culture example
Yeah.
where that kind of thinking, and literally it's like, I want every 10th letter of the Bible,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and then turn those letters, literally using the sounds that they make,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's 3 different, or at least 2 different letters to make the S sound, right?
Yeah.
And so you have some wiggle room to make
Right.
certain words say certain things. Yeah, and they were like predicting events in world history using every 10th letter of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
Every 15th letter tells you who the 15th president's going to be, and like ridiculous things. Like you said, computer generated gunk, and we were able to produce that on a micro level.
Yes.
Right.
Put it on display. How about the killed 600? He killed 600 dudes. Shamgar. And then we just point out how Saul had 600 men, how David had 600 men. And so we conclude from that, Shamgar clearly defeated all of the Philistine king's men.
Right.
Because all armies come in groups of 600.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's another example of that idea of parallelomania. It's just like, okay, the same numbers. Fair enough. It makes me think of that old saying, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It's just like, yep, it just happens to be the same number. And you don't have to read any kind of parallel in there just because they happen to be the same. You're going to need a little bit more. You can make convincing arguments. Like sometimes parallels are good and we should see them. There are a lot of good parallels in the Bible, but you have to build it off really kind of a preponderance of evidence. And here it was just so casual. Correlation does not mean causation or anything like that.
Yeah. I put it on the interesting but not compelling category.
Yeah.
It is interesting, actually. And I think we could do some research as to what's going on. Like, for example, the number 40 in the Old Testament has to do with a generation. It doesn't mean necessarily exactly 40 years, but say this generation ended and the next one started. And so, is something like that going on with 600? Is that a military term for,
Exactly.
That's what you need to look at, not making sort of correlations and connections that what 600 is doing in different contexts could be different. You'd have to do a little more investigating into that. So it's interesting, but not to the conclusions that we made.
Yeah, and especially because, with David and Saul, at least you can say they both had 600 men. That's interesting. Why did they both have that number? Right? Was that random or is that standard?
Yeah.
But it doesn't say that Shamgar had 600 men.
Right.
And in a way that prefigures David, he killed 600 men.
It doesn't say the Philistines had only 600 men.
Exactly.
He just happened to kill 600. That could have been 10,000.
And the Philistine king's not named in the account.
Right.
So there's no king named, and it wasn't the number of his men. It was the number of men he killed. So we're like 3 steps removed from what's going on actually in the Saul-David 600. But yeah, if you look for parallel numbers, again, a creative mind can make connections.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so the ox goad made of wood and the cross of Jesus made of wood.
This might have been the biggest reach we made, this entire thing.
Yeah, but again, when you get a symbol or an image in your head, you can read it in all sorts of places.
Yeah.
And so the idea of wood and things like that, in the same way. Well, to be honest, Paul doesn't do this exactly, but the wood of the ark saving people, and now that's actually a thing. So, why not this one? And, well, the answer is it's just because it's not.
Well, and it's pretty clear where he was saying this is analogous to that.
Yes,
right? Like the ark saves you, so now the waters of baptism, whatever. He's got waters and destruction and waters of and salvation, and he's just making an analogy. You're saved like this is saved, and so. At most, you could say, just like Jesus defeated evil on the cross, which was wood, Shamgar defeated evil with probably a wooden goad.
Sharp-pointed stick.
But that doesn't mean he has any unique connection to Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
It means, there's something they had in common. They used wood in their victory.
Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting, but not much beyond that. Yeah.
All right. Well, the last one, perhaps the most theologically significant, and maybe even the most to it, he delivered Israel, right? And the word for deliver is the word for save, and it's connected to the name of Jesus, who saves Israel. Yep. All right. Was this valid connection, or
no? And the reason is the word Yeshua is used a lot in the Old Testament. It means deliver, save. It used in lots of contexts, and so a lot of people could be considered saviors or deliverers, not just Shamgar. And so we don't go around calling everyone a prototype of Jesus, because it's just the word, right? And so you just got to be careful. Yes, but that word is then applied specifically to Jesus, right? And that's fine. That's what they're doing. You're going to be called Jesus because you're going to Jesus people from their sins, right?
Yeah.
That's what's going on. They didn't say anything about Shamgar Jesusing people, from their sins. He's delivering them from the Philistines, from these people who are oppressing them.
Like any successful king, judge, or military commander did.
That's what you do.
Yeah, if you go through the Old Testament and look at all the places where that term is used, for a person or group of people delivering Israel, Shamgar is just one in a list of a multitude who have done that exact same thing. So it doesn't draw special attention to Shamgar. And it's the opposite. It's like Israel's had a long list of deliverers, but Jesus is like the ultimate deliverer. He is a deliverer on steroids.
Yeah, you can read Jesus in light, because he's called by the name. That's the same root as what Shamgar did, deliverer.
Yeah.
You can read what does that mean that Jesus is the one who delivers his people. You can read that in light of how the word deliver functions in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And Shamgar is going to be one of the many examples that you have.
Yeah.
He is a deliverer. And of course, you can go the wrong direction. Like, well, how did they deliver? They delivered through violence. Or sometimes they delivered by God's mighty power, who fought the battle for them. Like, there's all sorts of kinds of deliveries.
Right.
So it's significant that Jesus is named that. It's not significant that Shamgar did that.
Right. At least no more than anybody else who
Right.
did that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So maybe we went a little too far when we suggested that he, Shamgar's the ultimate priest, martyr, son of God, savior, Davidic Messiah figure. Maybe that was going a little too far, more than the text would warrant.
Yeah.
How do we? I know we're out of time, but maybe how do people keep from making the kind of mistakes we kind of satirize in this episode? Like, what can we do to avoid? Or if we're wondering, man, you guys were awfully convincing at points that made me scratch my head. Like, how do people deal with the fact that they can't always verify people's theories? How do you inoculate yourselves or guard yourselves from being swept away from very creative but fundamentally flawed interpretations?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. The first is that we should look for the plain meaning of the text. Like we talk about, like, what is the text actually saying? We start with that, and because if it didn't make sense to the original reader in the plain sense, then why would it be something completely different years later, right? And so I just start with that. And so these very fanciful interpretations that come along from people that they like, I kind of wish they would be true, but I think, like, no, that's not what's going on. These fanciful interpretations are probably just a production of someone's creative mind, not what the text is trying to accomplish. And I know there's a lot of discussion in academic fields about original authorial intention, what they were trying to say, and some say you can never get to that. Sure, fine. But you can get close, I think. You can get in the ballpark. Yeah. And the ballpark is not gematria. It's not, the Bible code. It's there was this dude who lived and killed some people. Right? I mean, that's what's being said. And so going much beyond that, you should be careful, and you should eye it with some skepticism. It may not be completely wrong, but you don't just accept it because it sounds good.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that if the interpretation is beginning to sound very sensational, there's a decent chance they're probably going beyond what a good reading of the Bible looks like. And I would encourage people to just ask good questions. Listen. And again, if somebody is in a position of a teacher or whatever, listen to them. They probably have some good things to say, but don't just assume that everything that comes out of their mouth is pure gold. Ask good questions, investigate. Is this really a good way of reading the Bible? There is nothing wrong with that. I encourage my students to ask good questions. I think what I'm saying has validity to it, but you don't have to accept it just because I'm Dr. Peters. Check me out, push back. Let's explore this and find out if this is really something that we should accept, or maybe it was a really good idea, but it turns out it's not the best reading of the Bible.
Yeah. And if you have a good study Bible, see what that says.
Yeah.
Like sometimes some really cool things are happening in the text. Like you mentioned the second-born son, right? Like that is a theme. That kind of parallelism is there on purpose, and it's theologically significant about Israel being really second-born nation, like not the greatest among the nations. A good study Bible, a good commentary will highlight those things. And so you're like, okay, there are other smart people saying this kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's not just this weird podcast I listen to or this weird blog post. Like, check the other written sources that are reliable that you can trust. Don't go to another website to find verification, because there are other wackos out there too.
Sure.
Like, so, there'll always be a team of people who will back any kind of theory, which is a scary part releasing that episode. But, but there are trusted sources that you can go to verify these things. And there are teachers that God has placed in your churches people who've actually studied the language, right, can verify. And if they can't get to the original meaning and the sound use of Greek or Hebrew, then they probably have a professor who they can call up.
Yeah.
And ask. Say, "Hey, I heard this weird thing. Does this work?" If they can't answer for certain, say, "Hey, do you have someone you can ask?" And get to someone who can verify some of these things. So none of us, I think one of the biggest guards against fantastical interpretations is run them by people you respect.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not passing the sniff test with all your friends,
Yeah.
and you can't find backing in the study Bible or in commentaries, it's probably too crazy to be true.
Yep.
So accountability. How about that?
I like it.
Good call. Thank you so much for this non-satirical episode, listening to this non-satirical episode of the After Class podcast. After class, because
The best conversations happen
After class.